Was that another killing, or I'm assuming they lived that one?
Those two individuals, neither was deceased, but both were shot. They had exited. They were in the establishment. They had exited the establishment and immediately outside got into a fight over a gun, and both were shot.
Okay. And then 1 month later, in December 2014, there's a significant fight where both I believe it was the owner and the bouncer were assaulted, and in fact pistol whipped, or one of them was assaulted.
Mr. Vice Chair, yes, I believe that's what the record reflects.
Okay, and then others are more minor than, of course, shootings, but there were 3 youth alcohol compliance issues, 2 in 2014. And then I guess the one piece that really gets me is there were 3 licensed settlement conferences. Can you tell me about what happened in the course of those licensed settlement conferences, as well as the conditions that were set, and whether those conditions were ultimately met, and how those conditions did or did not alleviate some of the problems that were being experienced? So that's like a 3-part question. I'm happy to break it up for you.
Mr. Vice Chair, I would obviously reference the record that's in front of you, but I believe that it does reflect that there were 3 licensed settlement conferences, one in 2007, and then there was a 2-part licensed settlement conference in 2013 in which the licensee was represented by counsel on both at those licensed settlement conferences. And then there was a final licensed settlement conference in 2014. Each of those licensed settlement conferences resulted in progressive discipline, including fines and suspensions of either or both licenses that the establishment maintains, or a downgrade in the license. In one case, the establishment used to have a C2 liquor license, and it was downgraded to a Class E liquor license. A lot of conditions were imposed, and I think the record speaks for itself in terms of certainly a number of the conditions were basic conditions that were complied with. I would submit that the record does reflect that the condition regarding the panic hardware, which is an important fire code issue, has not been complied with, and I would further submit that even though that is an independent basis for which adverse license action can be taken, I think what the record reflects is that shows the lack of being able to be assured that conditions would be followed, and that's what the ALJ has recommended in this case is renewal with a different set of additional stricter conditions. And I think that failure to comply with conditions would go to evidence that that has been tried in the past and hasn't necessarily been effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. Do we have any further questions for Ms. Fussy? Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fussy, how many liquor licenses do we have in the city?
I would defer to Mr. Wilson.
Madam Chair, we have about 600 on-sale and off-sale liquor licenses. About 400 of those are on sale.
Okay, and of the 400, how many other businesses that you can recall have had 3 licensed settlement conferences and are still open?
Go ahead. Madam Chair, committee members, I can't think of another situation where we had that many licensing settlement conferences to resolve a problem.
And Mr. Fussy, if we were to revoke the liquor license as well as the late night license, could they still operate a restaurant with food without liquor, or it's a complete closure?
The establishment would have the ability to apply and to operate as a restaurant, and I believe that's the format in which they initially opened, although it was only for a brief period of time before they did upgrade to liquor licensure.
So
alcohol license.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Fussy. So if we were concerned that this is they have great food and they serve unique offerings and they serve the community, we wouldn't have to do anything about their business license, and they could operate as a restaurant and continue to sell good food and have great offerings and serve the community, correct?
Madam Chair and committee members, that's correct in terms of this action would only affect their specific liquor license and their late hours food license. There would be an ability, I think there might be an additional application that would be required, but I would imagine it could be approved regarding a restaurant licensure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fussy.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Any further questions or comments directed towards Mr. Fussy and or any others? Seeing none, I will move non-renewal of both the late night food as well as the liquor, but strongly encourage the business to stay open as a restaurant and an asset to the community. Any discussion or comments on that motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. That motion is passed. Mr. Fussy.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I would also request that the committee move to direct the City Attorney's Office to craft findings reflecting your action from today.
I'm sorry, so the staff direction would be to what?
To direct the City Attorney's Office to draft findings reflecting your action taken today.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. I move that we direct the City Attorney's Office to draft findings. All those in approval of that staff direction, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. That staff direction passes. Mr. Fussy.
Mr. Vice Chair and committee members, now that the committee has voted to deny renewal of both of the licenses, the law does require that the license holder be afforded an opportunity, should it so desire, to be heard on a request that the council stay enforcement of the license denials pending a possible appeal to the Court of Appeals. The case law on this is the case of DRJ Incorporated versus City of St. Paul, and it requires City Council to consider a license holder's request for a stay of any adverse license action. Very quickly, the standard that the appellate court requires a City Council to apply when determining whether or not to grant a stay pending appeal requires you to, quote, balance the license holder's interest in preserving the status quo so that effective relief will be available if the appeal succeeds against the interests of the public or the prevailing party in enforcing the decision and ensuring that they remain secure in victory while the appeal is pending. So at this time, it would be proper to hear briefly from the license holder's attorney if it should have a request for a stay pending appeal, and I would then request to be heard briefly in opposition to any such requests that Mr. Kushner might make.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. Mr. Kushner, would you like to speak on behalf of this point?
With all respect, I believe it's premature. The City Council actually has to take the action, and then we have to decide whether we're going to appeal, at which point then we would move for a stay of enforcement and would submit papers explaining our reasoning for a stay of enforcement. So unless the city attorney is willing to jointly agree to a stay of enforcement pending appeal, which I think would be really efficient, if they're not prepared to do that, then we'd prefer to raise that issue at a timely point.
Mr. Fussy?
Mr. Vice Chair, this is a procedure that's dictated by the case law, and it's a procedure that the city has used multiple times in the past, and I would advise this committee to hear any request for a stay at this time.
Yeah, I would agree. If you would like to make the request and any argument on behalf, you can certainly, I was going to say you can certainly submit additional paperwork later. I'm not sure if that would be, if you'd have the ability to do so following a decision, though.
Mr. Vice Chair, I don't think that would necessarily be timely for this committee to make its decision. Certainly he could submit anything to the full City Council. I would note also for the record that I did specifically speak with Mr. Kushner and advise him that if this council were to take any adverse action today, that we would immediately hear any request for a stay, which is in line with the city's past practice.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. Mr. Kushner, do you have any further argument regarding a stay?
Yes, well, based on the standards that Mr. Fussy stated, which is the standard of being able to preserve the status quo so that the party can have relief on appeal versus the harm or benefit to the public, that standard strongly gravitates in favor of the stay of enforcement, because if La Que Buena's licenses are not renewed, notwithstanding the comments that they can operate as a restaurant, the testimony at the hearing, which the administrative law judge adopted, was that it wouldn't be financially viable for them to operate with a liquor license, that the nature of the food that they sell is a type that people want to have alcohol, want to have wine or beer with, or alcohol, so they wouldn't be able to continue to operate. And so if they want an appeal, they wouldn't be able to reopen. I mean, this restaurant would be closed, and they'd have to go back to square one, and they'd no longer be operating. So it would eliminate their opportunity for relief if they're forced to close right away, versus the harm or benefit to the public. The testimony is undisputed that throughout the year there have been no incidents at the restaurant. Okay, so there's no dispute by any party that since the beginning of this year, there's been no incidents at the restaurant of a public safety or licensing issue, and so that they've shown that at this point they're able to operate lawfully, and so there wouldn't be a harm by allowing them to continue to operate during the several months that an appeal would be pending.
Thank you, Mr. Kushner. Mr. Fussy?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. On behalf of the Licensing Division in the Police Department, I would urge the committee to deny the request for a stay for the following reasons. The past history of the establishment, which includes an unsustainable amount of city staff involvement in oversight and resource allocation, inclusive of 3 license settlement conferences, multiple licensing violations, and an extensive history of criminal activity and substantial violence. The severity, quantity, and extent of the identified issues, violations, and incidents weighs heavily on the side of the public interest being best served by moving forward with this committee's decision to deny licensure of the establishment, as opposed to risking additional activity detrimental to the public interest and the public health by allowing the council action to be held in limbo for an appellate period that would assuredly stretch many months and could stretch over a year. Also, the establishment has, by its own admission, failed to comply with an important life safety condition of licensure in the past, and that reflects poorly on their ability to comply with any conditions that might be imposed upon a stay. And as previously mentioned, although in general terms the level of violent activity taking place at the establishment has decreased since the filing of this adverse license action, the record reflects that there have been other periods of calm at the establishment during the multiple years that the city has been expending disproportionate quantities of resources dealing with the violations and noncompliance at La Quay Buena. Certainly the violence could renew as it has previously done so, and the severity of the violence and infractions in the past weighs to the side of the balance to ensure public safety clearly and unequivocally. And the way that that can be done, the only way that can be assuredly accomplished is to properly and rightfully deny renewal of the license effective immediately. For these reasons, I request that the committee deny the stay request.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to move to deny the stay, and I want to speak to that issue. I want to remind members of the committee that if, God forbid, there was a fire and they have a history of over-occupancy and the back door is one that has to be pulled in rather than pushed out, what the fallout would be from something like that. We are aware of this fire code issue. We have asked in a license settlement conference for this to be resolved. We heard today in testimony and also in the record that they just thought it was too expensive and they weren't going to do it. And I can just imagine we've had situations where we've known or not even known there are fire code issues where the city is blamed. Here we know there's a fire code issue. In addition to that, there is a lengthy record of unwillingness to abide by license settlement conditions. And as a result of that, I think if it's urgent enough for us to revoke the license, it is urgent enough for us to do it immediately. And I would ask the committee to do so.
Councilmember Goodman has moved to deny the stay. Any further comment on that motion? All those in favor of Councilmember's motion to deny the stay, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. That motion passes. Mr. Fussy.
One final request would be to additionally direct my office to prepare findings regarding the stay issue as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fussy. I would move that we direct the City Attorney's Office to draft findings regarding the denial of a stay. All those in favor of that motion say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No, that motion passes. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. This is the conclusion of the last meeting of the year for this committee, so I just wanted to have an opportunity to say a few thank yous, most notably to our clerk, who continues to do an amazing job on our behalf, and we are very grateful to have you, and hope Casey will continue to have you as our clerk for the next term. I want to thank Ms. Brennan, Mr. Frank, and Mr. Lutz, who have so graciously adopted the regulatory services portion into our community development agenda, and appreciate your presence at these meetings. We've said many times, having you here to hear your staff doing their work, I think is a really important thing, and we really appreciate it. I want to extend a special thank you to Mr. Wilson for being so wonderful to work with and organized, and our two attorneys, both Shelley and Nikki and Mr. Fussy, who have done a really great job for us this year. I want to thank you all for a wonderful year. You as staff are the reasons that this committee moves forward on time, without a lot of controversy and with a good amount of content. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a happy new year.